Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 116. And this is for our class for Thursday, the 26th. So, as you know, I did not hold class on Tuesday. Things I know were challenging for many individuals in terms of the weather, so I thought it was just better to cancel class. I didn't necessarily know what everyone's situation was, and that we could start fresh today, which is what we are doing. Puts us a little bit behind, but we can catch up. And if you will remember, we had talked about Story of an Hour, and I wanted to read to you some of the ending questions in Story of an Hour to help you consider all of the different ways that you could think about literature. And then we'll see how far we can get today with how many short stories we can talk about. As you know, eventually you will be submitting in paper number 1, and I still suggest that target date of before spring break being the 12th of March. And some of you might already know what it is that you're going to be writing paper number 1 about. You might want to write about film, and if you're writing about film, you do have to write about Citizen Kane. Now, that said, you can create your own essay topic, but you need to have the topic approved by me ahead of time. I've provided you with 2 topics, one talking about canon and the other talking about contemporary relevance. And over the next couple classes, I'll talk a little bit more about some techniques for writing papers, which I hope is review from your English 101 class. And if you will remember, at the beginning of the semester, we had some chapters in our textbook devoted to how to read literature and, more importantly, how to write about literature, which is what you will be doing for your first paper. Approximately 5 pages, but as long or short as you think it needs to be for you to support your thesis, your position. And you would be doing so with evidence from the text, which means paraphrase and quotation, which we will talk a little bit more about. And everybody has the opportunity to rewrite the first paper, so that I think of the first paper as a learning exercise. We will talk about, or review, I hope, quotation in the next couple of classes, and usually we reference a page number. For film, what we reference is a timestamp, but more on that later, because I wanted to talk about Story of an Hour, where we were discussing how to go about and analyze it, and I think the ending questions are fascinating, the questions that appear in our textbook. And as you know, I've been trying to provide links for the actual pieces of literature or film that we are reviewing over the course of the semester, so that if it turns out that you don't necessarily have access or ready access to a textbook, you can at least access it online. But you may not be able to access the questions that appear at the end, such as, for Story of an Hour, do you find Mrs. Mallard to be a sympathetic character? Some readers think she's callous, selfish, unnatural, monstrous, because she revels in her newly discovered sense of freedom so soon after learning of her husband's death. Others read her as a victim of her inability to control her own life in a male-dominated society. Perhaps you can hold both views simultaneously. Are your views influenced by your gender? Or what about your age, which continually changes, by the way? Or what about your social economic background, your nationality, race, religion? Do you have particular views about the institution of marriage that inform your assessment of Mrs. Mallard's character? And I think these questions are important because they illustrate the subjectivity that oftentimes is involved with analyzing literature. That, yes, you need to take a position and you need to have evidence to support that position, but we're doing more than just reporting facts. That it's possible to have multiple interpretations that sometimes even contradict one another, and both would be equally valid. It's just dependent on which pieces of evidence you use to support your particular position. And many attorneys actually begin as English majors to learn these kinds of skills, because this is what a courtroom attorney does. A good attorney can argue defense or prosecution. They've got the same pieces of evidence. It's a question of which pieces of evidence that they focus on and present to the judge. So, in terms of thinking about some of our upcoming short stories, the Faulkner piece that I had us read is not only considered to be part of the canon, those works considered by scholars and critics worthy of academic study, but also I think is a fascinating example of how you can do something formulaic and yet not be formulaic. Because the reality is that A Rose for Emily is a very predictable story if you were to put it in chronological order. That's one of the more interesting things about this piece, is that it's written in non chronological order to try to hide the ending. And in fact, there are two endings to this piece. So if I were to put the piece in chronological order, that we have a Southern aristocrat from the 1900s, early 1900s, who basically is repressed and controlled by her father. Her father dies, and ultimately she has very much difficulty accepting that. She holds on to his corpse for 3 days, in fact. Eventually, she is able to give up the corpse, and she reemerges into society, and she begins to date, something that her father had forbidden. And she dates a northerner, a laborer, which is completely unexpected based on her class as a southern aristocrat, and also based on the idea that she would be doing something that would be considered not only unacceptable by her father, but also unacceptable by society as well. So she's breaking all kinds of barriers here. And if you think about the Southern aristocracy, which basically earned its wealth, didn't earn its wealth, it stole its wealth from the labor of others, slaves. And slavery is over, and yet what we see is Miss Emily clinging to a dead past. And I think that's important because death is a major theme in here, but it's also symbolic in that she's clinging on to this dead past of the way things used to be, and they're no longer that way anymore. As she is dating Homer, there's all kinds of speculation as to whether or not they will marry. And at one point, she's seen going to the pharmacist to buy some arsenic. She never tells the pharmacist why she's buying arsenic. And the pharmacist is too intimidated to ask her, so he supplies the answer, which is for rats. And then, oh, by the way, there also is insanity in Miss Emily's family. Then Homer is seen walking into her house, is never seen again afterwards. A smell begins to emanate from her house. The town, not wanting to confront Miss Emily, they try to eliminate the smell on their own. Miss Emily becomes a recluse and basically is living in that dead past. She is writing in calligraphy. She is trying to give China painting lessons, which is something that people aren't interested in anymore. She refuses modern mail delivery. She refuses to pay her taxes, a long, convoluted tale where it turns out that the town had told her, they lied to her, that her father had loaned money to the town, and therefore this was the town's way of repaying it, that she didn't have to pay her taxes. The reality is that now that her father is gone, she doesn't have money. She might still have the status of being a Grierson, but she doesn't have the inherited wealth that she would have had if the system of slavery still existed. So this is the way the town tries to protect her, I suppose, her feelings by not confronting her over the fact that she can't afford her taxes. Eventually, those individuals die in the town offices, and new politicians come into place and demand their taxes. And she not only refuses, but she tells them to see Colonel Sators, who, by the way, has been dead for quite a while now. Nevertheless, what ends up happening eventually, which is how our story begins, is that Miss Emily dies and the entire town goes to her funeral. Not necessarily because they care about Miss Emily, but they're curious about the inside of her home. And when the funeral is over and they go into her home, what they find is a locked room. And when they enter that locked room, it's obvious, if you've been reading this in chronological order, she killed Homer. And she kept the corpse. Remember, we saw some foreshadowing of her keeping her father's corpse. We know she has difficulty accepting death. In fact, she even wanted the townspeople to talk to Colonel Sators, who's been dead for years. Now, if you were able to anticipate that ending, Faulkner has a second ending for us to surprise us, perhaps to horrify us, that there was a strand of iron gray hair next to that corpse. And if we're reading very carefully, we find that her hair had turned gray long after Homer had disappeared. In other words, she's been lying with this corpse long after Homer's murder. And whatever your imagination can envision is much worse than anything that the author could provide, which is why ultimately, in this particular instance, Faulkner doesn't give us details. It's a very clever technique. Now, Faulkner's writing in a particular writing style known as Southern Gothic. And just very quickly, I teach a class in Gothic literature. Gothic literature really, it began in the 1700s with a very poorly written book, Castle of Otranto, but it established many of the conventions of Gothic, where you've got perhaps a haunted castle or a haunted house, possible supernatural events, lots of death and decay, damsel in distress, lots of other things of that nature. It was in the 1800s, and this was in England, by the way, where some of the most famous Gothic texts were written that you probably have some familiarity with because of the influence of film. So if you've ever heard of Dracula or Frankenstein or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, these were Gothic texts that were written using those conventions, and ultimately in the early 1900s were translated over into film, so they became available to the masses. And even though most people haven't necessarily seen, let's say, the 1930s Bela Lugosi film Dracula, something we talk about in my horror film class and actually view, at least you've got the conception in your mind of what a vampire is, because Lugosi basically made that iconic with the cape and the accent and so forth, and some of the folklore associated with vampires. Well, to give you an idea of how the Gothic basically developed over time, as you know, that New England was settled by England, and they basically created a New England. So you might have heard of an author like Edgar Allan Poe, who is writing in that tradition of the Gothic, but not necessarily setting his stories in a particular locale, specifically not setting his stories in Britain, let's say. And then there were a group of authors who set their stories in a particular locale in the southern part of the United States. And they were known as Southern Gothic writers. And William Faulkner is one of those authors. And what they were doing was using the conventions of the Gothic, though making some changes, in order to make commentary about the sordid history of the South. William Faulkner himself, his family had benefited from slavery. Faulkner was quite embarrassed about that and would oftentimes be very critical of the Southern aristocracy and the Southern system as a whole that developed slavery in his writing. And we see that in A Rose for Emily. That, yes, we've got a plot here that is in some ways very formulaic, but in other ways can be seen as symbolic. I mean, just think about the idea of what a rose could symbolize, because that is in our title, Rose for Emily. Most people think of the flower, and most people also will think of red, a red rose. And of course, the flower is delicate, the petals, but it also has thorns, and it can be hurtful and harmful. And that perhaps is applicable to Miss Emily. And the idea of red and all of the associations with violence, with blood, with passion, that can also be associated with Miss Emily. In fact, if you wanted to take this a step further, you could say that people often press roses, dry them out, and keep them as mementos. One could say that that's what Miss Emily does with Homer, as macabre as that is, but the Gothic is supposed to be macabre. Of course, there are other meanings to rose. Rose is a kind of pink color. It's not necessarily red, which could be, again, violence and passion. It's not necessarily white, which can be purity and innocence. It's a mixture of the two, and perhaps we can say that that's what Miss Emily is, too. And, of course, most people don't think of rose in terms of its verb form, which is the past tense of to rise up. And, of course, what we see in the story is the fall, the descent of the South. And rising Standing up was very common when a Southern aristocrat, especially a female, walked into a room. It was a way of showing respect. And this story is about a kind of old way of living that no longer exists, that Emily can't accept. Even today, for instance, people will rise in a courtroom to show respect. So, that mixed chronology is probably how the story is known best because it hides that double climax. But also, what's important about this particular story is the narrator, which is not Miss Emily. And if we read carefully, we see the narrator is a we narrator. Basically, this is the community telling the story, and we learn more about the community than we do about Miss Emily. It would be fascinating if we had the story from Miss Emily's perspective. So, what we do know about the community is that they are not very attractive individuals. Again, we're told that they attend her funeral because they think of her as a kind of fallen monument, which is not how I would want to be thought of at my funeral. And this kind of morbid curiosity about her, that they spend a lot of time gossiping about her. At one point, when she's buying the arsenic, the assumption is that she's going to commit suicide. And the townspeople, rather than intervening or offering help, they just wait to see what's going to happen as if it were a reality show unfolding. So, this is as much a piece that's critical about the Southern community as it is about Miss Emily because of that we narrator. And again, if you read this piece over and over, you'll see all of the clues that were hidden, such as the family insanity, the domineering father, Emily's denial of her father's death, that she keeps his corpse for 3 days, which is oftentimes viewed as a Christian number when you want to think about resurrection, Father, Son, Holy Ghost. Colonel Sartoris, her insistence that the politicians speak to a man who's been dead for a long time. Of course, Homer's disappearance, and then the smell that comes afterwards. Even the buying of the arsenic, one might say that Homer is a kind of rat, I suppose, because we assume that the reason why she kills Homer is because he won't commit to her in a relationship. And we're even told that he liked men. A lot of people have done something with that phrase to try to figure out Homer's sexuality. And it's less about sexuality and more about the idea that Homer is not going to commit to her because obviously he has a relationship with her, regardless of his sexual orientation. And the assumption in this time period is that if you have a serious relationship with somebody, well, you're going to commit, which is not what Homer's going to do. He's known as basically being a kind of man's man in the sense that he liked men. And again, we can speculate about his sexuality further, but the reality is that he's certainly not going to commit to Emily. And when he disappears and we see the smell, we see that this is the reason why Emily killed him, because basically she wanted to keep him. This is a kind of old formulaic movie. And when Miss Emily is living in this world of a dead past, that also is symbolic. You know, that the idea that she is refusing postal delivery and calligraphy and china painting shows how she's clinging on to something. We're told that her house is in great disrepair. It's a old southern mansion that basically is falling apart, which is representative of Miss Emily. We're told that instead that the modern world is encroaching upon it. Things like gasoline pumps and garages, which represents progress during this time period in the 1930s. No more horse and buggies. Cotton gins, which again, if you know your history, that basically led to, or one of the things that led to the ending of slavery is because it just wasn't economically profitable anymore, because ultimately the cotton gin had mechanized much of the manual labor that had been done previously. So if Emily represents, let's say, the Southern aristocracy, I suppose we could say Homer, the Northern laborer, represents both the North, and he represents the modernity of the North, which earns income based on labor, not necessarily on forced labor. But notice Homer's last name, Barron, and I think there's a commentary here about class and as much as there is about ethnicity, that ultimately Homer Barron, while he is a laborer, he's got the name of basically an economic structure that is oftentimes labeled as a kind of economic slavery, where the rich profit off of the labor of the poor, albeit compensated, but not compensated fairly. So we've got all of that for Rose for Emily, and after that we've got an interview by Faulkner where he talks a little bit about his ideas about A Rose for Emily. I think the interview is fascinating because it occurs years after Faulkner's written the story. That perhaps might be one of the reasons why Faulkner's answers are so frustrating, because they seem to be very general and they seem to not necessarily answer the questions. Maybe too much time has elapsed and he doesn't remember the specifics. Or maybe he doesn't want to offer us specifics because ultimately he wants us to wrestle with the meaning. Or maybe he's being truly honest that he didn't necessarily have an idea in his mind to make this symbolic, but as Faulkner says, if it can be read symbolically, he's saying that's not something that's incorrect, but it was no intention of his. In fact, he says it was no intention of the writer to say. And I find that fascinating when writers or anyone refers to themselves in the third person, the way Faulkner does. And I also find fascinating his explanation of the title Rose for Emily, because it seems to have so many possibilities, symbolic possibilities, and Faulkner basically says it's just a rose for Emily. It was that this poor woman simply had no life at all, and she had a lover and then she killed him, so it was a rose for Emily. And that 3-sentence answer I would find very insufficient for an academic analysis, which is what you're being asked to do with your paper. But of course, Faulkner's the author, so how can we disagree? And yet I dare to say that there's so much more there, whether it's something that Faulkner never realized consciously, whether it's something that Faulkner just doesn't remember, whether it's something that Faulkner didn't intend, or whether Faulkner's playing with us and basically giving us as little information as possible so that we are required to fill in the gaps, or maybe it's all of the above. So that interview I find fascinating because I've seen many a student do so much better in terms of answering a question such as what is the meaning of the title, A Rose for Emily, at least based on the criteria that we've discussed. And instead, Faulkner talks a little bit about he sees this tale as being a tension between God and Satan. And I remember when I first read that, I was rather confused, as the interviewer is, and asking, well, what exactly does that mean? Did one represent the... And Faulkner interrupts and says that it's merely that Miss Emily knew that you don't take a lover and you certainly don't murder, and she's facing the consequences of her crime. And again, I don't know if that's necessarily a satisfactory answer, but I find it to be fascinating that we hear the author's perspective, and yet our perspective can be different, or at least much more developed than what the author has given us. And I expect that. I certainly wouldn't want a 3-sentence response for paper number 1. There's enough in this story to dissect so that you could talk about these elements. I had suggested you might want to talk about canon, whether or not you think this is worthy of academic study. Does it have the depth and the complexity and the creativity? And you can answer both yes and no. And regardless of what position you take in your paper, either yes, it should be in the canon, or no, it should not be in the canon. There's enough evidence in there for you to defend your position so that both perspectives can be right, even though they are in complete opposition of one another. Same thing with contemporary relevance. My focus, though, is that if you're answering that question, that you're talking about contemporary relevance and not the other elements that are oftentimes associated with canon. That contemporary relevance, or timeless and universal themes, is oftentimes seen as a piece of canon, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the only way to establish canon. And if you are talking about contemporary relevance, that you understand the danger of losing control of that paper and talking about our time period, 2026. And remember that your goal is to talk about the text, whether you're talking about Citizen Kane, or you're talking about Story of an Hour, or you're talking about Sorrowful Woman, or you're talking about A Rose for Emily, or some of the short stories that are coming up. And again, you can create your own essay topic, but it does have to be approved by me, and it has to be on one of the texts that we are examining in class, as is indicated not only in my class videos, but also in the handout that I uploaded in our syllabus and other documents folder that indicates the requirements for the assignment. And again, I'm going to be talking a little bit more about some of the conventions of writing a paper. But first, I wanted to talk some more about some of the other options you might have for your paper. The 3 short stories that are coming up, and I kind of think of them as a group of 3. Young Goodman Brown's Soldier's Home and Battle Royal are all very different from one another, and yet they share similarities. And Young Goodman Brown, written by Nathaniel Hawthorne, is again a piece that's usually considered part of the literary canon that gives us, if nothing else, a sense of the history of New England, which is where we live, specifically Salem, Massachusetts, which is where the story is set. Of course, Salem, Massachusetts comes with its own folklore, probably best known for the witch trials, which is what this story is about, Young Goodman Brown. And when you read the story, you will see that it is very symbolic. In fact, it's something called an allegory, where something represents something else deliberately throughout the entire piece. So, yes, he's married to a woman named Faith, but that also represents young Goodman Brown's faith, for instance. Yes, he's going into a literal wilderness or forest, but that also represents the wilderness, that which is untamed in our own society. A coming of age tale where somebody has to accept the fact that evil exists. And for the Puritans, who helped to basically establish New England, this is a very difficult concept, because for the Puritans, life was quite simple in that there was either good, and that would be rewarded with heaven, or there was evil, that would be rewarded with hell, and there would be no in between. And what we see in Young Goodman Brown is that there is an in between. There is ambiguity, and that everyone, even those that purport to be the most holy, have evil and hypocrisy within them. However, what young Goodman Brown is never able to accept is that the evil also exists within him, which is why he dies with no hopeful verse upon his tomb. Because after the incident occurs where he thinks he sees a witch meeting, which, by the way, will never be verified, and you can never verify it because the text is deliberately ambiguous, as many pieces that exist that would point to the fact that supernatural events are occurring, there are an equal number of events in the text that would negate that. Deconstructionists love this because the idea of finding contradiction in young Goodman Brown is pretty clear. However, that said, it's supposed to be that way because we're even asked by the narrator at the ending, had Goodman Brown fallen asleep and dreamt a dream of a witch meeting? And the response is, be it so if you will. In other words, think that if you'd like. That's not important. What's important is what Goodman learns and how he changes and what we're supposed to learn from that, which I will talk a little bit more about next class. And then I gave you, and Young Goodman Brown is a hard piece to read because, remember, it was written for its time period, which would be 1835. Lots of these and thous in archaic language. You're going to have to untangle some of it. And when we move to something like Soldier's Home, I think you'll find it to be an easier read. The language is more contemporary. Now we're in 1925. Ernest Hemingway, again, another author who's oftentimes considered to be part of the canon, those works considered by scholars and critics that are worth literary study. He oftentimes writes very simply, but simple does not mean simplistic. This is a very complex tale in many respects. Again, think about the time period, about a soldier who has come home after World War I. That was a war that was supposed to end all wars. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. We had a world war, actually not too long after that, World War II. But nevertheless, a soldier returning home changed because of the war, and his society and his family unable to understand that change. Language we use today is PTSD, which was a term that did not exist at the time. In 1925, it was known as shell shock. And what we've got is a story of somebody who's home, but not really home. He might be at his house, but there is a difference between a house and a home. Home is where you're loved and understood. And we see how the war has changed Krebs. So you've got somebody who had religion in his life in one way or another. He did attend a Methodist college. His mother is religious. Who no longer is able to embrace religion. We see somebody who wants to have a relationship but doesn't want consequences. We see somebody who is unable to get a job and basically reintegrate back into society. And we see the ending where we see Krebs trying to appease his family by doing what they want, but is that really true to him? Has he had the opportunity to heal? Does anybody have really the ability to understand what he experienced? And in the end, is he just running away by trying to appease his family? Or is he finding a way to reintegrate back into society? Or even more interesting, can both be possible at the same time? So when you're reading Soldiers Home, you're going to read a lot of dialogue. Dialogue is usually easier to read than text. It's one of the reasons why this moves so quickly. And I can tell you that names are very important. So the fact that this character is referred to as Krebs by his surname is supposed to link him with the military that really he's still part of, even though the war is over and he's returned, even though the civilian world thinks he's returned too late. More on that next class. And his sister calls him Hare, a nickname. So one assumes that they have a closer relationship. A hare, Hare, is a rabbit, which is oftentimes associated with being skittish and fearful and living in a hole. And that's really Krebs. He's fearful and skittish. And you think about soldiers in foxholes. And I know that he has a very strange dialogue with his sister when she asks, "Will you be my beau?" No, that's not ancestral. It's more hero worship of a very young girl admiring her brother in a way that perhaps no one else does. And he says, "Sure, I can be your beau," because he knows it's nothing serious. No, it won't come with the consequences that he's trying to avoid, because war comes with consequences. And we see throughout that his father and his mother have expectations for him, and he's not really able to fulfill them and not able to articulate why he can't fulfill them. So expect that. And yes, mom calls him Harold because, after all, that is her son. So even something as subtle as that, as the shifts of Krebs or Harold or Hare, has a particular significance. Everything in Hemingway has significance. So some of the activities that he's engaged in, reading and home lunches and playing pool, these are all solitary activities. And think about playing pool. You have to aim and shoot when you're playing pool, which is what a soldier does, aiming and shooting. He's reading about the war because he can never really escape from the war. And he says that he's learning he was a good soldier. This is where he's getting his validation. He particularly likes the maps because he's lost and he's looking for direction. So this is some of what we will talk about next class with Soldiers Home. Notice that these are both meant to be instructional tales. So Young Goodman Brown is supposed to teach us something about sin and hypocrisy. Soldiers Home is supposed to teach us something about what it means to be a veteran. Again, we don't necessarily have to accept the message, but we have to be able to identify it. And Battle Royal, which is an ugly, brutal piece. So forewarning if you haven't read it yet. It's meant to be ugly and brutal because it's supposed to expose the ugliness of racism. And what we have is Ralph Ellison, a black author, writing in the 1940s. And this story is part of a novel called Invisible Man. Not The Invisible Man, which is a science fiction story about somebody who becomes invisible and is able to engage in all these activities. Invisible Man. So, in some ways, this is the hardest of all of the pieces, not only because of its brutality, but also because there's a bigger story to tell. However, the first chapter of the novel was released as a short story, standalone, called Battle Royal, which, if you've already read the piece, you know that we have a narrator who thinks of himself as invisible because people don't see his individuality, they only see the color of his skin. And he is reflecting back on his youth. So, this is an adult who's reflecting back on his teen years, where he basically has the opportunity, he sees it as an opportunity, to give his graduation speech to some of the leading citizens of the town. He thinks it's an opportunity to prove his worth despite his ethnicity because of the way that he would be viewed during this time period. And it's not an opportunity to prove his worth. It's an opportunity for him to degrade himself as he's put into a literal boxing match that is the figurative version of the boxing match that individuals who are disenfranchised have to fight every day in society. And at the ending of that brutal episode, he delivers his speech and makes a misstatement and says, instead of social responsibility, he says social equality, which changes the dynamic. And his audience is furious, an audience of the leading Caucasian citizens of the town. And the Invisible Man apologizes, but subconsciously he understands that maybe it wasn't necessarily an accident. And if you know any psychology, the idea is that any slip of the tongue is really a way for the subconscious to illustrate itself. And the Invisible Man has a horrible dream at night of his grandfather, and his grandfather is haunting him throughout this short story, where basically on his grandfather's deathbed earlier, the grandfather had said that he was an enemy in basically, or he was a spy, I'm sorry, in the enemy's territory. Invisible Man doesn't know what that means. He will find out. And we will talk about that. And that the grandfather's been living with his head in the lion's mouth. And he's been overcoming the enemy with yeses. But that isn't his true intent. And Invisible Man's dream is that the grandfather is mocking him. They're at a circus and he refuses to laugh at the clowns, even though grandfather's supposed to refuse, or even though the grandfather is supposed to laugh at the clowns. And that at the end, Invisible Man gets a message to basically keep running with the use of the N-word. Again, this is a very horrific piece, but I think that the language is important in order to illustrate the time period, much like we will see comparable language in Rose for Emily, again illustrating the time period. And he says that he doesn't necessarily understand what the significance of that dream is. He's just thrilled at that point that at the ending of the speech, he's presented with a scholarship to go to college. And he needs to learn later what that dream ultimately means. Well, I can try to summarize the novel for you. Again, I'm doing a very poor job in summarizing a very complex piece. In my opinion, perhaps the best book ever written, because it reads like a short story. It goes on for hundreds of pages, but every word has significance. So I can quickly summarize for you that the Invisible Man at the ending of that episode does go to college, and after a couple hundred pages, he realizes that college is a hollow dream for him because of the color of his skin, and that he will never be given opportunity or access. He decides the system is rigged, so he needs to join the political world to try to change the system, which he does, and he realizes that the political system can't be changed because that's rigged as well. That goes on for another couple hundred pages. And then he meets a character named Ross the Destroyer, who is just that, a destroyer. And Ross argues that everything has to be destroyed, dismantled, and basically built up fresh, which is what Invisible Man and Ross try to do. And when they try to have revolution and revolt, it results in a riot where they see their own community burning in front of them. Invisible Man realizes that that's not the answer either. So Invisible Man goes off to a basically neighborhood that he would never be allowed to live in because of the color of his skin, an all Caucasian neighborhood, and breaks into a basement that is filled with darkness. but yet Invisible Man steals all of this electricity by hooking up electric lights everywhere. Invisible Man is stealing power, so this is symbolic. He's stealing power. And Invisible Man says he's hibernating and he's contemplating what to do next. And that's how the novel ends, without providing us with a solution for racism, which I think is a brilliant ending because the challenge is for us as readers to come up with a solution. And perhaps in some ways our society has, because we do live in a different world. But in other ways it hasn't, because as we know, challenges still exist. And there is reference to a woman, and this piece addresses, albeit briefly, sexism and the objectification of female in the way that this woman is treated during this boxing match. But more on that later. So, you've got an idea of what these three short stories are going to be about. There will be two stories that follow after that, or I believe one story actually that follows after that, Popular Mechanics. So we'll be able to catch up soon. But today's attendance question, you can see I've left the notes below for the three short stories that I'm going to be discussing more in depth next class. And then we can finish up our short story unit with our last piece. But based on the three short stories that I've given you a sense of so far, Young Goodman Brown, Soldier's Home, or Battle Royal, I'm asking you to identify what you feel is an important quote in one of these three short stories and why. As you know, you're not required to respond to your peers' responses, though you're definitely encouraged to do so. Much like in class, if this were a face-to-face class, you are encouraged to respond to your classmates. But what you are required to do is to read their responses and my responses in turn. That'll give you a good idea of the class discussion and might also give you some helpful information for constructing a paper. But more on that later. Since I am cognizant of the time, I will end it here. I hope you are doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class talking about some specifics in Young Goodman Brown, Soldier's Home, Battle Royal, and ending with Popular Mechanics. Take care. Bye-bye.